Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today, I am super excited to talk to you about the second book in the Enemy Within campaign for Warhammer Fantasy. It's called Death on the Reich. I've raved about this campaign so many times in the past. The Enemy Within is one of the greatest published campaigns for a role playing game ever printed or ever played. It starts with The Enemy in Shadows, is what they're calling part one in this current edition of the game. And second is Death on the Reich. Now, there's a little bit of a speed bump moving from one campaign to the other, and we'll get to that. But once you get into it, the story is phenomenal. It's great. It's fantastic. So let's talk about the speed bump. Okay? In brief, the Enemy Within campaign is broken down into 4 or 5 parts, depending on how you count it. And part one and part two, part one has you basically in Bogenhofen, not the entire time, but for most of the time. Shadows over Bogenhofen is what it used to be called. And then everything kind of comes to a head there. Things crash down, things fall apart. I don't want to give spoilers. And then you move on to part two, Death on the Reich, in which instead of staying in a single city like Bogenhofen, you spend most of Death on the Reich on a riverboat, traveling through the Empire, going to a series of different places. And there's actually also some really fun opportunities to just become river merchants, to become traders who live on the river and buy and sell things. And the companion book to this book, which we will get to next month, gives a lot of really solid rules of how to do that, how to do the actual trading and become a merchant and what is life like on the river, and that's all great. But the campaign involves you kind of chasing down some rumors and some wizards and things like that. The speed bump comes from the fact that the connections between part one and part two, the motivations are incredibly flimsy. They are shockingly flimsy in terms of what is going to drive you forward. And in fact, if somebody were to pick up this book, Death on the Reich, and read through it without having read the first one, Enemy in Shadows, you would be completely at a loss for why the characters do any of the things that this book assumes they're going to do. There are no explanations given. Let me give you an example. One of the very first things you do as you leave Bogenhofen, the book assumes that you will go to Weisbruck. And it gives a couple of things, and it does, to its credit, throw out and say, if they don't want to go to Weisbruck, maybe you can have a plague that's downriver, and that'll force them to go upriver, whatever it is. And then you get to Weisbruck, and there are 2 things you can do there, both of which hinge on the idea that the player characters are going to be super interested in tracking down incredibly minor characters from the first part of the campaign. One of them, for example, is an herbalist named Elvira. And there is a whole little subplot adventure where she's been kidnapped and you have to track her down. There's no reason why you would even go and talk to her. She is presented in one scene in the first campaign, the first part of the campaign, and she is an optional character. She is not even a key part of the story. She is just a complete sidebar that says, if your characters are wandering around the Schaffenfest, here are some people that maybe they could meet. And one of them happens to be this herbalist. And she, it says, if the characters hit it off with Elvira, then she will invite them to come visit her in Weisbruck. And then, perhaps months of playtime later, when they leave Bogenhofen, on this incredibly tenuous connection, the campaign assumes that the first thing they're going to want to do is go to Weisbruck and hang out with that one person that they met one time and had like a 3-sentence conversation with, which, let's remind you, was an optional encounter that's not even part of it. And so to put so much weight of narrative motivation in part 2, to hang all of that on what was originally an optional encounter, doesn't make a lot of sense. Why are the characters going to go to Weisbrook? Why are they then going to follow on from Weisbrook to Altdorf? Why are they then going to try to go to Kemperbad? This campaign book, Death on the Reich, does not offer any answers to any of those questions. And yet, the procedure of the campaign requires them to do it. And so there is a moment of kind of railroady stuff as your characters run away from Bogenhofen and say, well, shoot, we got to get out of here. And then part 2 hands them their very own riverboat and they can do anything they want. You are going to have to create some reasons for them to go through and follow all of these things. Now, once you get over that bump, right? Once you provide those motivational bridges from part 1 into part 2, the rest of the campaign is as smooth as butter. Okay? It presents intriguing mysteries. It gives compelling reasons to follow up on those mysteries. There's a lot of interesting, fun, exciting things. And the story that it tells as you go along this river, kind of searching for these things and people, and I'm not going to say anything about them because I don't want to spoil it. Once you get there, 80% of this adventure is, again, one of the greatest adventuring campaigns ever published for a role-playing campaign. But that first 20% is so frustrating to read through here. And that will become much smoother, obviously, because this is part 2, and so some of that stuff was established earlier. But like I said, they're very flimsy, and you, as the game master, are going to have to either do a lot of work to create motivations where there are none, or you're going to have to just talk to your players and say, hey, next part of this adventure requires you to go to Altdorf and then to decide to go to Kemperbad. Everyone down with that? Sweet, let's do it. And once you get over that speed bump, like I said, it's great. So let's talk a little bit about why it's great. We're going to look at the big PDF here, and this has the potential of exposing some spoilers, so I apologize in advance for that. Now, the overarching story of the Enemy Within campaign is that the characters are dealing with a cult that is kind of rotting out the heart of the Empire, and it's called the Purple Hand. And trying to figure out what that cult is doing, and it is a very long story, and in fact it's very possible that your characters could get into Death on the Reich and still not know exactly who the Purple Hand is or what they're doing, because they play their cards so close to the vest. They are very good at hiding in the background and manipulating events from behind the scenes. Now, that is not a slam on the campaign, because that's part of what makes it fun, is unrolling and deciphering this very long-term thing. And in fact, the only reason that I mention the Purple Hand by name is because it's very, very likely that your characters are already going to have a pretty solid idea of who they are and what they're trying to do. One of the fun things that Death on the Reich does is it expands on this conflict. Enemy in the Shadows is dealing with a very specific thing that this cult is trying to do in Bogenhofen. And then once you get out, that world broadens. Not only are you traveling around, but you're meeting a wider range of people. There are competing cults and competing ideas and different things that you can be running up against. And so it's a much broader world. It is a much more open-ended adventure. In fact, a lot of the river stuff is a little more sandboxy. Once you get over that initial railroady transition from one part to the second part, then it becomes very sandboxy. In fact, you have the option of stopping anywhere along the river, of becoming merchants, of plying your wares, of you could spend ages just as river people going up and down the river and helping things and buying things and selling things while also following through the campaign. And in fact, that used to be a problem. I remember in the very early days of the internet, I read James Wallace, who was one of the original designers of the next section, part 3, which is called boy, now I can't remember. What's it called? Power in the something. Power Behind the Throne. How do we do this without spoilers? At the end of this book, at the end of Death on the Reich, it becomes necessary for the player characters to leave their life as river traders behind in order to proceed with the campaign. And if they are invested in the story, then that's an easy choice to make, because they find compelling evidence that they need to go to a certain place and they need to solve their problem and they need to move on. If the characters are not invested in the campaign, they may decide that they want to just stay on this river for a while. They're making money. It's not super dangerous. There's lots of, it's good. Eventually, because they're not solving it, the cult will destroy the empire and everything will come crashing down upon their ears and they'll get eaten by beastmen or whatever. But for now, they're feeling pretty fat and sassy. So, very famously, in an earlier edition of this campaign, James Wallace wrote a bridging adventure called Carrion Up the Reik that destroys the riverboat, burns it down. And I remember reading a very famous essay called James Wallace Destroyed My Life. And then James Wallace responds to that called Yes, I Effing Sank Your Barge, or Yes, I Sank Your Effing Barge, one of the two. And there's actually a delightful little thing in here, let's see, where we get a quick description by James Wallace. I don't know where it is. It's in here somewhere. Anyway, it was really fun to see that blog post referenced in here. And one of the reasons for that is that way at the end of this campaign, they have reproduced a portion of Carrion Up the Reich to bring it in here and help get the characters. Boom, there we go. A stop along the way. So, we will get off of that page right now. Woo, look at all this stuff, all these secrets that you're learning. So a portion of Carrion Up the Reich has been reproduced in here so that you're able to do the whole Death on the Reich thing, and then we have this really solid transition that is going to move you on to Part 3, Power Behind the Throne. It is painful to have your boat burned down. And I'm sorry for the spoiler that you know that at the end of this, your boat's going to get burned down. But it is an important part of the campaign. And as James Wallace notes in his essay, this is not a game about gaining power and riches and treasure. This is a game about surviving a world that hates you and wants to kill you. It is down in the gutter. It is down in the mud. If you end any adventure section better off than you started it, then something is probably gone wrong with the storytelling, because it's just a grim world that hates you and wants to kill you, as mentioned. So anyway, I really like this campaign. I really like the storyline in particular that this one tells, the mystery that it presents, and the way that it unfolds the way that you move around on the river, having so much freedom to do whatever you want while still trying to, figure out what's going on. It's just a really fun adventure, and I've got fond memories of being, back in the old days when I was playing this in first edition, being a river captain and going up and down the Reik and doing all these things. It's not the kind of experience that a lot of campaigns give you, and that's one of the reasons that I think it has stood the test of time so well. So, Death on the Reich, really, really solid addition to the Enemy Within campaign, and one that I think that you're going to enjoy a lot once you get over that initial motivational hump that forces you into it. So, anyway, check it out, definitely. Sorry, let's click the right buttons here. Boom, and we're back to my big face. So, I love this, and I think it's great, and I think that you will enjoy it. And anyway, thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching this review. I'm Dan Wells, and you are awesome.